The double glass doors of Mercy General Hospital did not just close, they sealed. It was a pneumatic, heavy hush, the sound of a pressurized airlock, engaging, cutting off the sterile world behind her, the persistent, low-frequency hum of the vending machines, the rhythmic beeping of cardiac monitors, and the squeak of rubber shoes on polished linoleum. All of it was severed in an instant. She stood in the vestibule for a moment, caught in the transitional space between the climate-controlled air of the hospital and the raw morning outside. She stared at the grey concrete under her feet, watching the toes of her white nursing shoes. They were scuffed at the tips, marked by 12 hours of continuous movement. She took a breath, holding it in her chest. The air in the vestibule was still stale, tasting faintly of floor wax and rubbing alcohol. She reached out and pushed the heavy metal bar of the outer door. It resisted her tired arm for a fraction of a second before swinging outward. The morning hit her face like a cold, wet sheet. It was Ohio in the deepest trough of winter. The air was not merely cold, it was crystalline, sharp enough to feel like it was scrubbing the inside of her lungs with every inhale. It smelled of ozone, frozen pine needles, and that distinct, metallic scent that comes before a heavy snow. She stepped out from under the concrete overhang. The silence was absolute. It was the heavy, muffled silence that only exists after a fresh snowfall. The world had been upholstered in white velvet. The asphalt of the parking lot, usually a cracked grey map of oil stains, was now a pristine, unbroken field of snow, glittering under the street lamps like crushed diamond dust. There were no cars moving on the main road, no distant sirens wailing toward the emergency bay. The city was holding its breath. The only sound was the delicate tick-tick-tick of ice crystals hitting the nylon shell of her coat as the wind shifted. She adjusted her bag on her shoulder. The strap dug slightly into the trapezius muscle, a familiar ache that had become a part of her anatomy. She didn't walk to her car. She couldn't bear the thought of the enclosed metal box, the smell of cold upholstery, the jagged noise of the engine turning over. Not yet. She needed the walk. She needed the rhythmic decompression of moving through the open air. She stepped off the curb. Crunch. The sound was satisfyingly dry. The snow was packed tight, dry powder rather than wet slush. She looked down as her foot sank an inch into the white layer, compressing the tiny ice structures. Crunch, crunch, crunch. It was a slow, hypnotic rhythm, a metronome setting the pace for her decompression. Fatigue was a physical substance. It wasn't just a feeling in her head. It was a heavy fluid that filled her limbs, making them feel dense and slow. It pulled in her lower back, a dull, throbbing heat radiating outward from her spine. It lived in the arches of her feet, which felt flattened and tender, every step sending a ghost of an echo up her shins. But the cold was helping. It was a numbing agent. The wind brushed against her exposed cheeks, stinging at first, then settling into a cool, anesthetizing buzz. She blinked, her eyelids feeling like sandpaper against her eyes, dry from the recirculated hospital air. She let her eyes stay closed for a step, then two, trusting the emptiness of the sidewalk. Under her heavy coat, she became aware of her own layers, the scratchy synthetic blend of her scrubs against her skin, the tightness of the compression socks she wore to survive the shift. She longed for the moment she could peel them off. But for now, the sheer act of walking was loosening the knots. She passed under a street lamp that flickered with a low electric buzz. The light was sodium orange, casting long, soft shadows that stretched out from her heels like pools of dark ink. She watched her breath plume out in front of her, a thick, grey cloud of steam that swirled, expanded, and dissolved into the darkness. Inhale. The cold air rushed down her trachea, expanding her ribcage, cooling the heat in her chest. Exhale. The stress of the night, the code blue in room 304, the weeping family in the waiting room, The endless charting flowed out with the steam, disappearing into the morning mist. She focused on the sensation of her hands. Even inside her wool gloves, her fingers felt stiff. She flexed them, creating a soft friction sound, wool rubbing against wool. She was reclaiming her body. For 12 hours, her hands had belonged to the patients, adjusting IVs, checking pulses, writing notes. Now, curled into fists deep in her pockets, they were hers again. She turned the corner onto Oak Street. The architecture changed here, shifting from the brutalist concrete of the medical district to the softer, older brick of the historic neighborhood. And there, halfway down the block, was the beacon, the roasted bean, in the blue-grey palette of the pre-dawn morning. The coffee shop was a radiant cube of amber light. The large front window was framed in dark, distressed wood. Condensation had fogged the glass from the inside, blurring the interior into a cozy, impressionistic smear of gold, brown, and copper tones. It looked like a lantern left burning in a snowy forest. She approached the door. The handle was brass, shaped like a long, curved leaf, polished to a shine by years of use. It was cold to the touch, biting through her glove. She gripped it and pulled. Jing-a-ling. The bell above the door wasn't an electronic sensor. It was real brass, attached to a coiled spring. The sound was bright, cheerful, and archaic. As the door opened, the sensory transition was violent in its comfort. The cold was instantly severed, replaced by a wall of warmth so thick it felt like walking into a hug. The air was heavy, humid, and rich. It smelled of dark roasted Sumatra beans, the sweet, woody scent of cinnamon bark, and the faint, underlying aroma of old paper and baked yeast. It was the smell of safety. She stepped onto the floorboards. They were wide plank oak, worn smooth and dark in the center of the aisle. Thump, creak, thump. The room swallowed the sound of her footsteps. The shop was nearly empty, occupied only by the silence and the dust motes dancing in the beams of the track lighting. Behind the counter, the espresso machine hissed a sharp, sudden release of steam that sounded like a sigh of relief. The barista, a young man with messy hair and a faded flannel shirt, was there. He didn't speak to her immediately. He knew the drill. He was rhythmic in his movements, wiping down the steam wand with a damp cloth, the motion circular and meditative. The scrape of the cloth against the metal was a soft, scratching sound that blended with the low, mournful jazz playing from the ceiling speakers. A double bass plucked slowly, vibrating in the air. She walked to her booth in the back corner. It was her sanctuary within the sanctuary. The seat was upholstered in a deep, forest green velvet. The fabric was crushed in places, worn bald in others, but it was soft. She slid in. The springs inside the cushion gave way with a soft whump, accepting her tired weight, cradling her hips and lower back. Now, the ritual of shedding. She unlooped her scarf, feeling the cool air hit the sweat that had gathered at the nape of her neck. She pulled off her gloves, placing them on the table. Then, she unbuttoned her heavy coat, letting it fall open like a shell she no longer needed. She rested her elbows on the table. The surface was wood, varnished thick, but scratched by decades of ceramic mugs and silverware. She ran her thumb over a deep groove in the grain, tracing the lifeline of the timber. It felt tacky and solid, real. She didn't look at her phone. She didn't look at a menu. She just sat there, staring at the sugar dispenser, watching how the light refracted through the glass jar. Her heart rate, which had been a steady, anxious drumbeat all night, finally began to slow. Thump, thump, thump. She closed her eyes. The sound of the grinder whirring to life in the background was loud, but not jarring. It was the sound of preparation, the sound of care. She was here. The night was over. She was just a body, resting in a warm box of light, waiting for the sun to catch up to her. She turned her head slowly to the left, resting her cheek against the high, velvet wing of the booth seat. Her gaze drifted to the window, the massive pane of glass that separated her sanctuary from the waking world. From this close distance, the window was not a transparency. It was a landscape. The heat of the shop had battled against the freezing morning air, creating a weeping wall of condensation. Droplets of water, small as pinheads, clung to the glass in a dense fog. As she watched, the laws of gravity took hold of one specific droplet. It grew heavy, swelling until it could no longer hold its grip, and then it slid. It carved a jagged, meandering path down the pane, clearing a streak of visibility through the fog. Through that narrow, clear river on the glass, she saw the street. The world outside was painting itself in shades of bruised blue and iron grey. A snowplow rumbled past in the distance, a hulking beast of yellow metal and flashing amber lights. It moved slowly, its heavy blades scraping against the asphalt with a deep, resonant grinding sound that vibrated faintly through the floorboards of the shop. It pushed a wave of heavy, dirty snow to the side, clearing the artery of the city. She watched it go until the red taillights dissolved into the swirling mist. The contrast made her shiver, not from cold, but from the memory of it. Out there, the wind was searching for cracks in coats. Out there, people were scraping ice off windshields with numb fingers. But in here, the air was still and golden. In here, the only weather was the steam rising from the espresso machine. She felt a detachment, a floating sensation common to those who work while the world sleeps. She was a ghost in the machine of the morning, observing the start of the day from behind a protective barrier. Her eyes felt heavy, the lids drooping, fighting the biological imperative to close. She kept them open by focusing on the dust motes dancing in the track lighting, tiny, suspended galaxies swirling in the thermal currents of the room. Her attention shifted from the window to the counter. The barista, whose name she vaguely recalled, was Elias, was the only other living soul in the room. He was not merely working, he was operating within a private rhythm, a silent ballet of service. She watched him with the dull, unfocused fascination of the truly exhausted. He stood before the large, chrome espresso machine, an Italian monolith of levers, dials, and steam wands. He did not rush. There was no frenzy of the morning rush yet. There was only the process. She watched his hands. They were pale, dusted with the fine brown powder of coffee grounds. He reached for the portafilter, the heavy brass handle locking into his palm. He held it under the grinder. Whir. The sound was a low-frequency hum, consistent and smooth. A mound of dark, fragrant earth piled up in the metal basket. He stopped the grinder. With a practiced, fluid motion, he leveled the grounds with his index finger, sweeping the excess away. Then, he picked up the Tampera-heavy, flat-bottomed tool. He pressed it down into the coffee. She imagined she could feel the pressure in her own arm, the resistance of the grounds packing tight, transforming from loose powder into a solid, resistant puck. He polished the surface with a small twist of his wrist. It was satisfying to watch. It was order being created out of chaos. It was the opposite of the emergency room, where fluids spilled and lines tangled and bodies failed. Here, variables were controlled. Temperature, pressure, time. He locked the portafilter into the group head. Click, clack. The sound was mechanical and precise. He flipped a switch. She watched the extraction. It began as a hesitation, a pause where the water infused the puck. Then, a dark, viscous liquid began to drip. It looked like melted chocolate, heavy and syrupy. It straightened into a thin, steady stream. A mouse tail, they called it, changing colour from deep brown to a reddish hazelnut foam. The crema. The smell drifted over to her booth. It was complex burnt sugar, toasted nuts, and a hint of dark cherry. It triggered a primitive response in her brain, a signal that help was coming, but she hadn't ordered yet. She realized, with a slow, lagging thought, that she was too tired to stand up and walk to the register. She would just sit here for another minute, just one more minute of stillness, before she summoned the energy to speak. She closed her eyes for a second, letting the darkness wash over her retinas. The jazz saxophone climbed a scale, faltered, and resolved into a low, breathy note. The sound of footsteps interrupted her drift. They were soft steps, rubber on wood, approaching her rhythmically. She forced her eyes open, her lashes fluttering. Elias was standing at the edge of her booth. He didn't have a notepad. He didn't have the expectant, polite smile of someone waiting for an order. In his hands, he held a ceramic mug. It was a wide-brimmed bowl of a cup, glazed in a speckled oatmeal colour, heavy and thick-walled. Steam rose from it in lazy, spiralling ribbons. He lowered the mug onto the table. He did it with extreme care, as if he were placing a sleeping bird into a nest. He didn't slide it. He placed it. Clink. The sound of the ceramic bottom meeting the wooden table was a dull, solid note. The vibration travelled through the wood and touched her elbows. She stared at the cup. The latte art on the surface was a fern leaf, a rosetta perfectly symmetrical, the white microfoam cutting sharply against the deep brown canvas of the espresso. She looked up at him, confusion clouding her face. Her voice was rusty, unused for the last hour. I haven't ordered yet." Elias smiled. It wasn't a customer service smile. It was smaller, more genuine. He wiped his hands on his apron. "You don't have to," he said. His voice was soft, pitched low so as not to disturb the quiet of the room. "This one was paid for about 20 minutes ago." She blinked. The information took a moment to traverse the fog in her mind. "Paid for a gentleman." Elias said, "He comes in early. He saw you pull into the lot. Saw you sitting in your car for a while before you walked over. He said you looked like you were carrying the whole world." Elias reached into his apron pocket and pulled out a small, folded piece of paper. It was a napkin, the edges rough where it had been torn. "He asked me to give you this with the coffee." He placed the paper next to the mug. Then, with a nod that was almost a bow, he retreated. He backed away into the shadows of the counter, returning to his machine, leaving her alone with the gift. She stared at the napkin. The paper was thin, cheap, porous. She reached out. Her hand trembled slightly, a tremor of fatigue, or perhaps sugar deprivation. Her fingertips brushed the paper. It felt dry and light. She unfolded it. The writing was done in blue ballpoint ink. The handwriting was jagged, hurried, perhaps written against the dashboard of a car or the rough wood of a table. It wasn't poetry. It wasn't a sermon. It read, "Thank you for keeping on." Just 5 words. She read them once, then twice. The silence in the shop seemed to deepen, pressing in around her, but it was no longer heavy. It felt like a blanket being tucked in. She looked at the coffee. The heat radiating from the cup hit her face, warming the skin that was still cold from the walk. She wasn't just looking at a beverage. She was looking at a signal. A stranger had seen her. Not nurse, not employee. Just a human being who was tired. A lump formed in her throat, not of sadness, but of a sudden, overwhelming release. The tight knot in her chest, the one she had been carrying since shift change, began to dissolve. It melted like the snow on the glass. She sat there, the steam bathing her face, the small scrap of paper anchored under her thumb. For the first time in 12 hours, she wasn't taking care of anyone. She was being taken care of. She placed the note gently on the table, smoothing the corner with her thumb. The paper settled against the wood, a small white flag of kindness. Her attention turned fully to the mug. It sat before her, a heavy, round-bellied vessel. It was not a delicate teacup. It was substantial, thick-walled ceramic, designed to hoard heat. The glaze was a speckled oatmeal colour, uneven and organic, feeling slightly rough against her fingertips, like the surface of an eggshell. She didn't lift it yet. First, she needed the heat. She uncurled her hands, which were still pale and stiff from the winter walk. She brought them to the cup, curving her palms around the ceramic bowl without lifting it from the table. She didn't touch it all at once. She hovered for a microsecond, feeling the radiant energy pushing against her skin before closing the gap. Contact. The heat was instantaneous and intense. It bypassed the numbness of her skin and travelled directly into the bones of her fingers. It was a sharp, beautiful shock. The sensation of life returning to a dormant limb. She held the cup like a prayer, her hands forming a protective shell around it. She closed her eyes. She could feel the thermodynamics at work. The heat from the dark liquid inside was transferring through the clay, moving into her palms, travelling up her wrists, seeking out the cold blood in her veins. It was a slow, steady diffusion. She sat there for a long time, just breathing, just holding. The tension in her forearms, the tightness that came from gripping guardrails and pens and steering wheels, began to unravel. The muscles softened, turning liquid in the warmth. The cup anchored her to the table, to the room, to the present moment. She was no longer floating in the haze of exhaustion. She was grounded by this sphere of heat. She leaned forward, bowing her head over the cup. The steam was rising in a lazy, vertical column. It hit her face softly, a humid kiss against her dry skin. It felt like a warm towel pressed against her cheeks. She inhaled deeply, filling her lungs to capacity. The smell was a complex architecture of comfort. First, the top note, the sweet, airy scent of the steamed milk. It smelled of cream and vanilla, a childhood scent, innocent and soft. Then, the heart note, the roasted depth of the espresso. It was earthy, smelling of dark soil, burnt caramel, and smoke. It was the smell of a fireplace on a cold night. Finally, the base note. A faint, nutty aroma hazelnut, or perhaps pecan, that lingered at the back of the nose. It was an olfactory embrace. The scent bypassed her logical brain, the part that worried about schedules and vital signs, and went straight to the limbic system, the center of memory and emotion. It told her body, "You are safe. You are provided for. You can rest." She opened her eyes and looked down at the surface of the coffee again. The latte art, the delicate fern leaf, had shifted slightly as the microfoam settled. The tiny bubbles were popping. One by one, microscopic collapses that were too quiet to hear but mesmerizing to watch. The white foam was glossy, reflecting the warm amber lights of the shop. She rotated the cup on the saucer. The ceramic scraped softly against the ceramic. Scrape. Hush. She found the spot where the rim was smoothest. She prepared herself. She lifted the cup. It was heavy, dense with liquid. The weight of it was pleasing. It required intention to hold. She brought the rim to her lips. The ceramic was hot, but not burning. It felt solid against her mouth. She tilted the cup. The liquid moved. It breached the dam of her lips. First came the foam. It was impossibly light, an airy velvet that dissolved the moment it touched her tongue. It was sweet, carrying the natural sugars of the milk, warmed to the exact temperature where sweetness blooms. Then, the liquid underneath broke through. The espresso was dark, rich, and robust. It washed over the sweetness of the milk, creating a perfect balance, bitter and sweet, heavy and light. She didn't swallow immediately. She let the coffee sit on her tongue, savouring the texture. It was silky, an emulsion of oil and water that coated the inside of her mouth. She swallowed. The sensation was a slow, warm slide. She could feel the liquid travelling down her throat, tracing a line of heat through the centre of her chest. It moved past her collarbone, past her sternum, settling deep in her stomach. It was like swallowing a glowing ember. The warmth radiated outward from her core. It blossomed in her chest, pushing back the chill that had lodged there during the walk. She exhaled a long, shuddering breath through her nose. Her shoulders, which she hadn't realised were still hunched, dropped 2 full inches. Her spine curved into the back of the booth. She took another sip. This one was deeper, more confident. The flavours were clearer now. The nutty undertone, the hint of dark chocolate, the warmth seemed to reach her toes. The noise of the world outside the snowplows, the wind, the distant traffic faded into a meaningless hum. The only reality was this tactile loop, the heat in her hands, the steam on her face, the silk on her tongue, the warmth in her chest. She was drinking in patience. She was drinking in the kindness of a stranger. Every molecule of the liquid felt like it was repairing a microscopic tear in her spirit. She lowered the cup, but didn't let go. She kept her hands wrapped around it, hoarding the warmth. She stared at the half moon of foam remaining on the side of the mug. A feeling of heavy, golden drowsiness began to wash over her. It wasn't the painful, jagged exhaustion of fighting sleep. It was the soft, inevitable pull of true rest. The coffee wasn't waking her up. It was comforting her down. It was a warm bath for her insides. She blinked slowly. The edges of her vision softened. The golden light of the shop seemed to expand, wrapping her in a cocoon. She was melting. She was safe. Time in the hospital was a rigid thing. It was measured in seconds, in heartbeats, in doses administered, in the digital flicker of numbers on a monitor. It was a jagged line that demanded constant attention. But here, in the golden warmth of the roasted bean, time had lost its structure. It melted. She sat with the mug cradled in her hands, though the liquid inside was now merely warm rather than hot. 10 minutes might have passed, perhaps 20. It didn't matter. The clock on the wall, a vintage piece with Roman numerals and rusted hands, seemed to be ticking slower than the laws of physics should allow. Tick, silence, tock. She listened to the rhythm of the room. It was a soft, layered, acoustic tapestry. There was the low, persistent hum of the refrigerator unit behind the counter. There was the hiss of the radiator, a metallic exhale that sounded like a sleeping dragon. There was the soft shh of Elias sweeping the floor at the far end of the shop, the bristles of the broom kissing the wood. She felt a physical loosening in her chest, the tightness that lived between her shoulder blades. The armour she wore to survive the night shift was dismantling itself. It fell away, piece by piece, dissolving into the upholstery of the booth. She wasn't just sitting, she was floating. The booth felt like a raft drifting on a calm, golden lake. The demands of tomorrow, the laundry, the bills, the next shift felt impossibly distant, existing on a different continent entirely. Here, in this suspended moment, there was nothing to do. No alarms to answer, no charts to sign, just the simple biological imperative to be warm and still. Her eyes drifted back to the small scrap of paper on the table. Thank you for keeping on. She traced the blue ink with her eyes. She didn't try to conjure a face for the stranger. He was nameless, faceless, and somehow that made the gift more powerful. If she knew him, if he were a neighbour or a colleague, there would be a social contract involved. A need to smile, to say thank you, to perform gratitude. But this was pure. It was an invisible act, launched from the shadows, asking for nothing in return. She thought about the trajectory of the gesture. He had stood where she was sitting. He had looked out at the cold. He had seen her car, a solitary metal box in the vast, empty lot, and in that moment, a silent thread had been spun between them. It was a thread of recognition, she realized, with a slow, dawning warmth, that she wasn't invisible. All those hours walking the corridors, checking IVs in the dark while patients slept, she often felt like a ghost haunting the halls of the living. But someone had seen the ghost. This realization changed the quality of the silence around her. It was no longer the silence of isolation. It was the silence of companionship. She felt part of a vast, invisible web of humanity. It was a philosophy she often forgot in the triage unit, where humanity was reduced to symptoms and trauma. But here, in the quiet morning, she remembered, we are all just people seeking shelter from the cold. We are all just waiting for the sun to rise. The thought was sedative. It settled over her mind like a heavy quilt. The world was not a hostile place to be fought. It was a shared space to be endured. Together. She turned her head to the window again. 20 minutes ago, the view had made her shiver. The snow had looked relentless, the ice cruel. But now, through the lens of the coffee and the kindness, the landscape had transformed. The condensation on the glass had frozen into intricate patterns, feathers, and ferns of ice, crystalline maps that refracted the streetlights into tiny prisms. It wasn't a barrier anymore. It was art. She looked through a clear patch in the frost. The sky was shifting. The deep, bruised purple of the night was softening into a pale, milky lavender. The sun was still below the horizon, but its promise was there, bleeding upward into the clouds. She saw a figure walking on the sidewalk across the street, a man in a heavy coat, walking a small dog. The dog was bounding through the snow, burying its nose in a drift, tail wagging furiously. The man waited, hands deep in his pockets, watching the animal with patient affection. Before, she might have felt pity for him being out in the cold. Now, she felt a kinship. You are awake, too, she thought. You are keeping watch. She watched the snow falling. It was no longer a storm. It was a lullaby. The flakes fell straight down, heavy and slow. Large tufts of cotton drifting from a grey ceiling. They landed on the pavement, on the cars, on the trees, dampening the sound of the city, wrapping everything in soft, white bandages. The world looked soft, rounded. The sharp edges of the buildings were blurred by the snow. The harsh lines of the power cables were thickened with white. She took the final sip of her coffee. It was lukewarm now, but still sweet. The sediment at the bottom, the mud, was dark and chocolatey. She swallowed it, feeling it seal the warmth inside her stomach. She placed the empty cup back on the saucer. Clink. The sound was final. The ritual was complete. She felt heavy, but it was a good heaviness. It was the weight of a stone settling at the bottom of a clear river. The current of anxiety that usually rushed through her veins had slowed to a standstill. She sat for a moment longer, her hand resting near the note. She didn't need to take the paper with her. The words were etched into the morning. She was ready to go home. Not to collapse, but to rest. There was a difference. One was an act of defeat. The other was an act of peace. The mug was empty. At the bottom, only a ring of tan foam remained, drying against the ceramic, a map of the comfort she had consumed. She sat for one last moment, memorizing the feeling of the booth. The velvet against her spine, the solid wood under her elbows, the golden light bathing her hands. She took a deep breath, inhaling the coffee-scented air one last time, storing it in her lungs like a diver taking a final breath before submerging. It was time. She moved slowly, deliberately. There was no jagged rush to leave. She slid to the edge of the booth, her legs feeling heavy but steady. She stood up, her muscles stretched. A long, silent elongation of the spine. The stiffness from the night shift was gone, replaced by a loose, fluid lethargy. She reached for her coat. It had been lying next to her on the bench, absorbing the ambient heat of the shop. When she slid her arms into the sleeves, the lining was warm. It didn't feel like a heavy burden anymore. It felt like a protective husk. She buttoned it up. Click, click, click. The large plastic buttons slipped through their holes. She did up the collar, sealing the warmth against her throat. She picked up her scarf. She wound it around her neck, once, twice. It was a soft embrace, smelling faintly of lavender. Finally, she pulled on her gloves. She flexed her fingers, feeling the wool conform to her hands. She was armoured now. She was a vessel carrying a precious cargo of warmth, insulated against the winter. She looked at the table. The empty mug sat on the saucer. Beside it, the small scrap of paper. Thank you for keeping on. She couldn't leave the note. It belonged to her now. She picked it up, folding it carefully along the existing crease. She placed it in the deep pocket of her coat, right against her hip, where she could feel its slight weight. Then, she reached into her bag. She pulled out her wallet. The leather was cold and smooth. She opened it and withdrew a bill. It wasn't a fortune, just enough for a latte and a pastry. She smoothed the bill out on the table, pressing it flat against the wood. She placed the salt shaker on top of it to anchor it. She looked up and caught Elias's eye from across the room. He was drying a glass, the towel moving in slow circles. He paused. She didn't speak. The silence of the morning was too perfect to break with words. She simply nodded to him. A slow, deliberate lowering of her chin. Then she glanced at the money on the table, and then at the door. Elias understood. He smiled, a small crinkling of the eyes. He nodded back. The transaction was complete without a single syllable. The ripple had started. The energy she had received, the care, the acknowledgement, was not ending with her. She was leaving it there, on the scratched wooden table, waiting for the next ghost who walked in from the snow. She walked down the center aisle. Her boots made a dull, confident thud-thud on the floorboards. She reached the door. She gripped the brass handle, which was still cold, but the sensation didn't make her flinch this time. She pulled. Jing-a-ling. The bell sang its bright, brassy farewell. She stepped over the threshold. The door hissed shut behind her, sealing the coffee shop back into its golden bubble. She was outside. The cold hit her instantly, but it felt different now. An hour ago, the air had felt like a knife. Now, it felt like a crisp, clean sheet. It was refreshing. It cooled her cheeks, which were flushed with warmth. The light had changed. The sun had broken the horizon. The bruised purple of the dawn had given way to a pale, brilliant blue. The world was no longer hidden in shadow. It was illuminated. She walked toward the parking lot. Crunch, crunch, crunch. She looked at the snow. It wasn't just a bleak, white blanket anymore. It sparkled. Millions of tiny ice crystals caught the low angle of the sun, flashing with microscopic rainbows, flecks of pink, teal, and gold scattered across the ground. She saw the trees. Their bare branches were coated in ice, looking like sculptures made of glass. They didn't look dead. They looked dormant, resting, waiting patiently for spring, just like her. She reached her car. It was covered in a layer of snow, looking like a sleeping animal. She didn't feel annoyance at having to brush it off. She felt a strange tenderness. She used her gloved hand to sweep the snow off the driver's side door. Swish. Swish. The sound was soft, like fabric rubbing against fabric. She opened the car door and slid into the seat. The interior was freezing, the leather stiff and unyielding. But it didn't matter. The warmth was inside her. The coffee, the kindness, The quiet, it was a glowing coal in the center of her chest, radiating outward, keeping the cold at bay. She started the engine. It turned over with a sluggish groan before catching. The heater blasted cold air for a moment, then slowly began to warm. She didn't turn on the radio. She didn't need the noise. She just watched the steam of her own breath, rhythmic and steady. She put the car in reverse. As she backed out, she glanced one last time at the coffee shop. The window was still glowing, a square of amber in the blue morning. Inside, Elias was likely picking up the bill she had left, preparing the next cup for the next weary traveller. She smiled, a small, tired, genuine smile. She drove out of the lot, the tyres crunching softly on the packed snow. She was heading home, toward her bed, toward the heavy, dark curtains and the flannel sheets. The day was just beginning for the world. But for her, the peace had already arrived. The drive home was a blur of white and grey, a journey through a tunnel of falling snow that seemed to erase the road behind her. By the time she pulled into her driveway, the world had become soft and indistinct. She climbed the wooden steps to her porch. They were dusted with a fresh layer of powder that muffled her footsteps. She reached into her pocket, her fingers bypassing the folded note to find her keys. The metal was cold, jagged, and familiar. She slid the key into the lock. Slide. Click. The mechanism turned with a satisfying, heavy thud. She pushed the door open and stepped inside. The air in her apartment was still and cool, preserved exactly as she had left it 12 hours ago. It smelled of lavender laundry, sachets, and the faint, sweet scent of old paperbacks. It was the smell of sanctuary. She turned and closed the door. She engaged the deadbolt. The clunk. That sound was the final punctuation mark of her day. It was the sound of the drawbridge pulling up. The world, with its beeping monitors and icy winds and demands, was now locked out. Inside, there was only safety. She towed off her boots. They fell to the mat with a heavy thud, leaving damp, dark footprints on the rubber. She peeled off her socks, her feet, finally naked against the soft fibres of the hallway runner, expanded with relief. The floor was cool, grounding her. She walked down the hallway. She didn't turn on any lights. The grey morning light filtering through the blinds was enough. It cast striated shadows on the walls, like the bars of a soft cage, holding the silence in. She unbuttoned her coat, hanging it on the hook. It swung gently, back and forth, a pendulum slowly losing its momentum, until it came to a complete rest. She entered her bedroom. This was the inner sanctum. The room was dominated by the bed, a vast island of white linens and heavy quilts. She moved to the window. The sun was fully up now, a brilliant, blinding white glare off the snow. It was too bright, too loud for eyes that needed darkness. She reached for the blackout curtains. They were thick, heavy velvet, the colour of midnight blue. She pulled the left side, then the right. Swish. The transformation was instant. The brilliant white morning was choked off, replaced by a deep, artificial twilight. The room became a cave, cool and dim. The only light remaining was a thin, glowing line at the bottom of the sill, a reminder that the world existed, but only at the edges. She moved to the dresser. The ritual of changing was slow. The scrubs, stiff, synthetic, smelling of the hospital, were peeled away. She dropped them into the hamper. She put on her sleep clothes, a pair of oversized flannel pants, worn soft by 100 washes, a cotton t-shirt that felt like a second skin. The fabric was loose, allowing her blood to flow, her skin to breathe. She went to the bathroom, but she didn't turn on the overhead light. She washed her face by the dim grey light of the doorway. The water was warm. She cupped it in her hands, splashing it over her eyes, washing away the grit of the night. She patted her skin dry with a plush towel. The fabric was rough enough to stimulate the skin, soft enough to comfort it. She brushed her teeth, the rhythmic shh, 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 echoing in her head. She rinsed. She spat. She looked at her reflection in the mirror. Her eyes were dark, heavy-lidded. She didn't look exhausted anymore. She just looked ready. The tension around her mouth had smoothed out. The furrow in her brow was gone. She returned to the bedroom. She approached the bed. She pulled back the duvet. It was heavy, filled with down, a cloud waiting to envelop her. The sheets underneath were flannel, patterned with small, faint stars. She sat on the edge of the mattress. It sank under her, a slow, yielding dip. She swung her legs up. She slid down between the sheets. The sensation was exquisite. The sheets were cool against her legs, but the duvet trapped her body heat instantly, creating a pocket of warmth. She wiggled down, deeper, until the covers were pulled up to her chin. Her head found the pillow. It was the perfect density, firm enough to support her neck, soft enough to cradle her skull. She let the weight of her head sink into it. She lay on her back, staring up at the darkened ceiling. Her body began to shut down, system by system. Her feet, which had walked miles, grew heavy and numb. Her hands, which had held the warm mug, uncurled completely, resting open on the mattress. Her jaw unhinged. Her tongue fell away from the roof of her mouth. She focused on her breathing. Inhale. The quilt rose. Exhale. The quilt fell. The silence of the room was not empty. It was full of peace. It was a heavy, fluid substance that filled her ears. Her thoughts began to fragment. They lost their sharp edges. She didn't think about the patients. She didn't think about the charts. Instead, her mind drifted back to the coffee shop. She saw the golden light. She felt the ceramic handle in her hand. She saw the steam rising, curling into the shape of a fern. And she saw the note. "Thank you for keeping on." The words floated in the darkness behind her eyelids. They were glowing, soft blue neon in the black void. Keeping on. Keeping. Keep. She felt a wave of warmth wash over her, a phantom echo of the coffee. It started in her chest and spread to her limbs. It was the feeling of being held. The kindness of the stranger was a tether, anchoring her to the earth while her mind floated away. She wasn't alone in the dark. She was part of the web. The room seemed to tilt gently, like a boat on a calm sea. Rock, rock. Her breathing slowed. It matched the rhythm of the snow falling outside, soft, silent, deep. The boundary between her body and the bed dissolved. She was no longer a solid thing. She was mist. She was steam. She was drifting. The darkness was not black anymore. It was a deep, velvet purple. The world faded. The light faded. The thought faded. There was only the rhythm. In, out. And then, finally, the deep, unbroken silence of sleep. The rain in Kansas does not always fall. Sometimes, it seems to lean against the world. It was a heavy, grey curtain that had descended upon the plains in the early afternoon and had not lifted since. Inside the cabin of the number 42 bus, the world was reduced to the rhythmic, sweeping arc of the windshield wipers and the low, steady vibration of the engine, a deep, mechanical purr that resonated through the floorboards and into the soles of Arthur's shoes. Swish, thump, swish, thump. The sound was hypnotic, a metronome keeping time for a song with no melody. Arthur sat nestled in the driver's seat, a throne of worn vinyl and memory foam that had long ago moulded itself to the shape of his back. He was a large man, broad-shouldered and soft around the middle, built like the rolling hills that surrounded the town. His hands, resting lightly on the massive, circular steering wheel, were mapped with the lines of 60 years, the skin papery and dry, yet steady. The bus was empty. It had been empty for the last 3 stops. The interior lights were dimmed to a soft amber glow, reflecting harmlessly off the wet windows. Behind him, the rows of seats stretched back into the shadows, silent and vacant. There was a specific kind of quiet that lived inside an empty bus at the end of a shift. It was not a lonely silence, it was a companionable one. It was the sound of a job done, of a vessel resting. The air inside smelled faintly of lemon floor polish, damp wool, and the metallic tang of the heater vents pushing warm, dry air against the chill of the evening. Arthur exhaled, a long, slow breath that seemed to deflate his chest by an inch. He shifted his weight, feeling the slight creak of the suspension as the bus took a wide, gentle turn onto Main Street. The town was blurring past the glass smears of red taillights, the fuzzy halo of street lamps struggling against the downpour, the dark silhouettes of storefronts closing for the night. He checked the dashboard clock. 6:42 p.m. The numbers glowed in a dull, reassuring green. 18 minutes until the depot. 18 minutes until the engine would be silenced, the lights extinguished, and the keys hung on the hook in the brake room. Arthur let his gaze soften. He wasn't really looking at the road anymore. He was feeling it. He knew every pothole, every slight gradient, every patch of tarmac that had been repaired last summer. The bus was an extension of his body. When the tyres rolled over a puddle, he felt the water displace. A momentary hush in the friction of rubber against road. He reached out with his right hand and adjusted the heating vent. A stream of warm air brushed against his knuckles. It was a small comfort, a tiny luxury. He thought about the thermos of coffee sitting in the cup holder to his left. It was empty now, but the steel was still lukewarm to the touch. He ran his thumb over the rim, tracing the circle, grounding himself in the present moment. The fatigue was setting in, but it was not an unpleasant exhaustion. It was a heaviness that started in his eyelids and flowed down like honey into his shoulders, his elbows, his hips. It was the feeling of gravity reclaiming him after a day of vigilance. His uniform, a crisp blue shirt that had started the day starched and stiff, had softened, relaxing its grip on his neck. He rolled his neck slowly, hearing the tiny pops of tension releasing, like bubbles rising to the surface of water. The rain intensified. It drummed against the metal roof of the bus, a chaotic, million-fingered tapping that wrapped the vehicle in a cocoon of white noise. It made the interior feel smaller, safer. Here, inside the glass and steel box, the elements could not touch him. He was the captain of this dry, warm ship sailing through the liquid evening. He tapped the brake pedal gently as he approached a red light. The air brakes hissed along, sighing, psh. As the great machine came to a halt, the bus rocked forward imperceptibly, then settled back on its haunches. Arthur waited. He did not look at his phone. He did not turn on the radio. He simply sat. He watched a droplet of water on the side window. It clung to the glass, trembling against the wind, growing larger as it collected smaller droplets, until finally it became too heavy and streaked downward, leaving a clear, jagged path in its wake. He thought of his house, waiting for him at the end of the drive. He thought of the silence there, different from the silence of the bus. The silence of the house was vast, filled with the memories of Martha. But tonight, the bus felt closer. The bus was small. The bus was manageable. The light turned green. Arthur eased his foot off the brake and pressed the accelerator. The engine rumbled, a deep-throated growl that climbed an octave as the bus gathered momentum. The motion was smooth, fluid. He wasn't rushing. There was no one to pick up, no schedule to chase anymore. This was just the glide. He glanced in the rearview mirror. The empty seats stared back. In the dim light, the The texture of the fabric seats looked soft, almost velvety. The aisle was a clean, straight line leading to the back window, which was now just a square of grey static. He felt a deep sense of gratitude for this solitude. The world outside was wet and cold and complicated, demanding and loud. But in here, the temperature was 72 degrees. The humidity was controlled. The rhythm was set by the wipers. Swish, thump. He was safe. He was warm. He was almost home. The depot was approaching. He could see the familiar chain-link fence and the expansive paved lot where the other buses slept in neat, diagonal rows. But before the final turn, there was one last stop, the old Miller Road station. It was technically the end of the line, the turnaround point before heading into the garage. Usually, he didn't even stop completely, just slowed down enough to verify no one had fallen asleep in the back row, then looped around. Arthur slowed the bus. The tyres made a wet, sticky sound as he pulled toward the curb. The rain was coming down in sheets now, blurring the world into an impressionist painting of greys and blues. He engaged the parking brake. Psh! He sat for a moment, letting the engine idle. The vibration travelled up his spine, a gentle massage. He closed his eyes for just a second, listening to the rain hammer against the roof, feeling the warmth of the heater on his legs, sinking deeper into the worn embrace of the driver's seat. He was perfectly still. The world was perfectly still. Then, he opened his eyes and looked out the side window, preparing to check his mirrors and make the final turn. The transition from motion to stillness changed the atmosphere of the bus. Without the hum of the tyres against the asphalt, the sound of the rain became absolute. It was a rhythmic, enveloping static, a heavy curtain of water that seemed to seal the bus off from the rest of the universe. Inside, the air remained still and golden, suspended in the amber half-light of the dashboard gauges. Arthur turned his head slowly to the right. The pneumatic hiss of the door mechanism sat dormant, waiting for a command he did not intend to give. This was the old Miller Road stop, a lonely patch of concrete on the edge of town, where the sidewalk gave way to overgrown fields. At this hour, on a Tuesday, in a storm like this, it was usually a ghost town. It was merely a waypoint, a place to check the mirrors before swinging the long nose of the bus back toward the depot. He looked through the glass of the passenger door. The window was fogged at the edges, the condensation blurring the world outside into a watercolour smear of charcoal and bruised purple. He reached out with a gloved hand and wiped a small circle on the glass. The condensation yielded, cool and damp under his fingertip, revealing a porthole into the storm. The world outside was hostile. The wind had picked up, whipping the rain sideways so that it slashed against the shelter, a flimsy structure of corrugated metal and plexiglass that offered little more than a suggestion of protection. The streetlight above flickered, its sodium vapor bulb buzzing audibly, casting a sickly, intermittent orange glow on the wet pavement. Arthur's gaze drifted over the familiar scene. The overflowing trash can, the advertisement for a lawyer peeling off the back wall, the puddle that always formed near the curb. Now a small lake rippling with the impact of 1,000 raindrops. And then his eyes stopped. There was a shape on the bench. It was not a pile of discarded clothes, nor a trick of the shadows. It was a figure, small, compact, still. Arthur leaned forward slightly, the leather of his seat creaking beneath him. He narrowed his eyes, adjusting his focus through the rain-streaked glass. The figure was a boy. He couldn't have been more than 12 years old. He was sitting on the very edge of the metal bench, his knees pulled up tight against his chest, his feet hovering just above the rising water of the puddle. He was dressed for a different day, perhaps a morning when the sun had been shining. He wore a thin, red windbreaker that was visibly soaked through, the fabric clinging dark and heavy to his small shoulders. His jeans were splattered with mud up to the shins. On his feet, He wore canvas sneakers, the kind that drank water instantly. Arthur could almost feel the phantom sensation of cold, wet socks against his own skin, a damp chill seeping into the bones of his toes. The boy was not moving. He was not looking at his phone. He didn't seem to have one. He was not pacing or looking anxiously down the road for headlights. He was simply enduring. He sat with the stoic, paralyzed patience of a child who has realized he is in a situation too big for him to solve. His backpack, a bright blue thing with a cartoon character keychain hanging from the zipper, was hugged tightly to his chest. It was his shield, a dry island he was protecting with his own body. Arthur watched him. The bus idled, a warm, vibrating beast. The distance between them was less than 10 feet, but it was a chasm of experience. Inside, the temperature was regulated. The air smelled of coffee and lemon. Outside, the air smelled of wet earth and ozone, and the wind bit with the sharp teeth of late autumn. The boy shivered. It wasn't a violent shake, but a subtle, convulsive tremor that started in his shoulders and rippled down his spine. He tucked his chin deeper into the collar of his wet jacket, trying to disappear into himself. A droplet of water fell from the brim of the shelter, landing squarely on the boy's nose. He didn't wipe it away. He just blinked, his eyelashes heavy with moisture. Arthur felt a tug in the center of his chest. It was a physical sensation, like a string being pulled taut. He looked at the clock on the dashboard. 6:49 p.m. The last scheduled pickup for this route had been at 6:15. The next bus, the morning starter, would not come until 5:30 a.m. tomorrow. The boy was waiting for a ghost. He was waiting for a system that had already shut down for the night. Arthur looked back at the boy. He studied the curve of the kid's cheek, pale and stark under the flickering street lamp. He saw the way the boy's knuckles were white where he gripped the straps of his backpack. There was no panic in the boy's posture, only a profound, silent resignation. He looked like a small statue of endurance, a testament to the quiet tragedy of being small in a big, indifferent world. In his mind, Arthur saw the rulebook. It was a thick binder sitting in the depot office. Strict adherence to schedules. No unauthorized passengers. Liability. Insurance. The words were black and sharp, but the rulebook did not know about the rain. The rulebook did not know about the specific hollow ache of being 12 years old and realizing you are invisible. Arthur's hand moved from the steering wheel to the gear shift, then hovered over the door lever. He paused. He wasn't thinking about the rules anymore. He was thinking about the physics of cold. He was thinking about how quickly a small body loses heat. He was thinking about the silence of his own house, and how the silence of this boy was different. It was a silence that needed an answer. He didn't feel pity. Pity was a loud, messy emotion that looked down on people. What Arthur felt was a calm, horizontal recognition. He recognized the fatigue in the boy's slump. He recognized the vulnerability. It was a shared frequency of existence. Humans are soft, and the world is hard. And sometimes, the only thing that separates the two is a sheet of glass and a heater. The rain hammered harder, a sudden squall that rattled the bus windows. The boy on the bench flinched, shrinking even smaller, burying his face into the damp nylon of his backpack. That was it. The deciding moment. It wasn't a grand moral epiphany. It was simply the refusal to let the cold win. Arthur took a breath. He inhaled the warm, dry air of the cabin, filling his lungs with the safety he possessed. Then, he decided to share it. His fingers wrapped around the cold metal of the door lever. He didn't yank it. He pulled it gently, deliberately. Hisses, clack. The sound was sharp in the quiet night. The pneumatic cylinder engaged, and the bifold glass doors of the bus swung open. The barrier was broken. The roar of the rain suddenly flooded into the bus, louder and more immediate. The smell of the storm-wet asphalt, dying leaves, cold wind swirled into the entryway, mixing with the scent of floor polish. Arthur didn't speak immediately. He just sat there, a large, warm presence framed by the open door. He leaned slightly to the right so he could look directly at the bench. The boy looked up. The movement was slow, stiff. His eyes were wide, dark pools reflecting the interior lights of the bus. He looked confused, as if a spaceship had just landed and opened its hatch. He stared at the open door, then at Arthur. He didn't move toward the bus. He seemed unsure if the invitation was real, or if this was just a mechanical error. A bus venting its air before driving away. Arthur stayed still. He let the warmth of the bus spill out onto the sidewalk, an invisible carpet unrolling toward the child. He kept his hands visible on the wheel, his face open and calm. He waited, letting the boy process the sudden appearance of light in the darkness. He was no longer just a driver. He was a lighthouse keeper who had just opened the window. The boy moved. It was a hesitant unsticking of wet sneakers from the concrete, a slow peeling away from the backdrop of the storm. He stepped off the curb, his foot splashing into the gutter stream, and crossed the 3 feet of asphalt that separated the cold world from the warm one. He grabbed the silver handrail inside the bus door. His hand was small and pale, the knuckles red from the wind. He pulled himself up the rubber-lined steps, squeak, squish, dragging the weight of his soaked clothing with him. As he reached the top step, standing on the flat platform next to the driver's seat, Arthur moved his hand to the lever. Clack hisses. The doors folded shut. The sound was final and satisfying, like the closing of a heavy book. The roar of the rain was instantly decapitated, severed from the air and replaced by the low, steady thrum of the idling engine. The silence that followed was thick, filled only by the sound of water dripping from the boy's hem onto the floor. Drip, drip, drip. The boy stood there, shivering violently now. The adrenaline of the cold had worn off, leaving him trembling in the sudden warmth. He didn't look at Arthur. He looked at his shoes, watching the small pool of rainwater forming around them on the black ribbed mat. He looked like a stray cat that had been let in, unsure if he was about to be shooed back out. Arthur did not ask him where he was going. He did not ask for a ticket. He did not ask for a name. Those were questions for the daytime, for the world of schedules and clipboards. Instead, Arthur engaged the parking brake, fully. A deep, ratcheting click-click-click that anchored them in place. He turned his body in the seat, the vinyl groaning softly under his weight, and began the ritual of the sanctuary. First, the atmosphere. Arthur reached out to the dashboard control panel. His fingers, thick and calloused, found the rotary dial for the passenger cabin heater. It was currently set to low. He gripped the plastic knob, feeling the ridges against his thumb and forefinger. Slowly, deliberately, he turned it clockwise. Click, click, click. He turned it all the way to high, deep within the belly of the bus. A fan whirred to life, the pitch rising from a low hum to a steady, comforting drone. The vents overhead and along the floorboards began to push air with renewed vigor. Arthur could smell the change immediately, the scent of heated dust and dry metal, a toasty, industrial aroma that promised safety. He watched the boy's hair stir slightly as the warm draft reached him. Next, the insulation. Arthur leaned to his left, reaching down to the canvas duffel bag he kept wedged between the driver's seat and the side wall. This was his kit, his emergency supply. He unzipped the bag. Zip. The sound sharp and clean. He bypassed his lunchbox and his spare logbook. His hand dived deeper, past the flashlight, until his fingers brushed against soft, dense cotton. He pulled out a towel. It wasn't a fancy towel. It was a simple, oversized workshop towel, white with a blue stripe down the center. But it was clean, and more importantly, it was bone dry. It had been sitting near the heater vent all day, absorbing the ambient warmth of the cabin. Arthur held it in his hands for a moment, testing its temperature. It was warm. It felt like a loaf of bread, fresh from the oven. The texture was rough spun, but forgiving. A fabric designed to dry things thoroughly. He didn't just shove it at the boy. He shook it out once flat, opening it to its full width, presenting it not as a rag, but as a mantle. Arthur extended his arm. "Here," he said. His voice was a low rumble, gravel moving slowly downhill. "Dry." The boy looked up, startled by the sound. He looked at the towel, then at Arthur's face. He saw no judgment in the old man's eyes, only a patient offering. The boy reached out. His fingers brushed the cotton. He took it, clutching it with a desperate kind of greed. He immediately buried his face in it. Arthur watched as the boy scrubbed his hair. The friction, silent and frantic. The towel absorbed the rain, darkening in patches, taking the cold away from the child's skin. But the ritual was not finished. Arthur turned back to his console. In the cup holder sat his stainless steel thermos. It was old, the green paint chipped away to reveal the silver beneath, dented from years of rolling around the cabin. It was a heavy, bomb-proof vessel that kept heat trapped for 12 hours straight. Arthur unscrewed the cap. It spun with a smooth, metallic grind. He set the cup, which doubled as the lid on the dashboard. Then he unscrewed the inner stopper. Pop! A wisp of steam escaped, curling lazily into the amber light of the cabin. The smell of black tea, rich and malty, drifted into the air, mingling with the smell of the wet wool and the floor polish. Arthur tilted the thermos and poured. The liquid was dark mahogany, steaming aggressively. The sound of the pouring was a high-pitched, melodic glug, 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 glug filling the small plastic cup. He didn't fill it to the brim. The bus would be moving soon, and he didn't want it to spill. He filled it halfway, just enough to warm the hands, just enough to warm the chest. He recapped the thermos, sealing the rest of the heat away. He picked up the cup. The plastic was hot against his fingertips. He held it out, bridging the gap between the driver's seat and the entryway again. "Careful," Arthur said softly. "Hot." The boy lowered the towel from his head. His hair was a chaotic mess of damp spikes, but his eyes were clearer now. He looked at the steam rising from the cup. He shifted his backpack, letting it slide down to the floor with a wet thud, and took the cup with both hands. He didn't drink immediately. He just held it. He brought the cup close to his chest, letting the heat radiate through the thin, soaked fabric of his windbreaker. He closed his eyes and inhaled the steam. Arthur saw the boy's shoulders drop another inch. The tension was melting, dissolving into the sugar and caffeine and warmth of the tea. Arthur watched the boy's hands. They were gripping the cup so tightly his knuckles were white, but the shaking had stopped. The transfer of energy was complete. The heat from the engine, the heat from the towel, the heat from the tea. It was all flowing into the boy, fighting back the Kansas storm. Arthur waited until the boy took his first small, tentative sip. He saw the grimace at the heat, followed by a sigh of relief that seemed to empty the boy's lungs completely. Satisfied, Arthur turned back to the front. He placed his hands on the steering wheel, reclaiming his position as the captain. He didn't say, "Sit down." He didn't have to. The bus was a sanctuary now, and the boy knew what to do. Arthur listened. He heard the shuffle of sneakers moving down the aisle. He heard the wet squelch of the boy sitting down in the seat, directly behind the driver, the one closest to the big heat event. He heard the rustle of the towel being wrapped around shoulders like a cape. The bus was quiet again, but it was a different silence. It was no longer empty. It held a fragile, recovering life. Arthur released the parking brake. Psh! He shifted the bus into drive. The engine note deepened, accepting the load. "Going home," Arthur whispered to the windshield. He pressed the accelerator. and the bus pulled away from the curb, leaving the empty, rain-lashed bus stop behind in the darkness. They moved forward, a warm, lighted capsule gliding through the night, carrying a secret passenger towards safety. The bus did not accelerate so much as it gathered the night around itself and pushed forward. The re-entry into the flow of traffic was seamless, a slide of heavy machinery into the stream of wet asphalt. Arthur drove with a newfound religious delicacy. Usually, at the end of a shift, his driving was efficient muscle memory guiding the 40-foot vessel back to the barn. He would take corners with a calculated sharpness and let the air brakes hiss their loud complaints. But tonight, the physics of the bus had changed. He was no longer transporting empty space. He was transporting a fragile, thawing soul. The rain was torrential now, a dark, aqueous wall that the headlights struggled to pierce. The beams cut 2 cones of illuminated static into the darkness, catching millions of falling diamonds that shattered against the asphalt. Swish, thump, swish, thump. The wipers were the heartbeat of the journey. Their rhythm was slow, hypnotic, a pendulum swinging back and forth, wiping away the chaos of the world to reveal brief moments of clarity. Arthur adjusted his grip on the wheel. He held it at 4 and 8 o'clock, his palms loose, his elbows relaxed. He scanned the road ahead not just for obstacles, but for disturbances. He saw a pothole 50 yards ahead, a black, water-filled crater in the tarmac. In a normal moment, the bus might have shuddered over it, a jarring thud clunk that would rattle the windows. Tonight, Arthur saw it in time. He checked the side mirror. The lane to his left was empty. He eased the wheel over, a movement so gradual it was imperceptible. The bus drifted, floating sideways like a cloud. The tires hummed over smooth pavement, bypassing the crater entirely. Behind him, there was no sound of sliding backpacks or shifting feet. The boy remained undisturbed. Arthur glanced in the oversized rearview mirror. It was a wide, panoramic strip of glass that showed him the entire interior. The bus was a tunnel of dim, warm light. The rows of empty seats stood like silent sentinels. But there, right behind his left shoulder, was the boy. He had curled up. He was no longer sitting rigid. His legs were tucked up onto the seat, his wet sneakers hanging off the edge so they wouldn't muddy the fabric. A small, ingrained politeness that made Arthur's heart ache. The boy was wrapped in the white and blue workshop towel, looking like a small monk in prayer. He held the thermos cup with both hands, the steam rising up to tickle his chin. He wasn't sleeping yet, but he was in the state that precedes sleep. His eyes were heavy, blinking slowly, fixed on the passing world outside his window. Arthur wondered what the boy saw. Through the rain-slicked glass, the town was transformed. The traffic lights weren't just red and green circles. They were long, bleeding streaks of ruby and emerald, smearing across the wet blackness. The neon sign of the all-night diner was a fuzzy pink nebula. The headlights of oncoming cars were starbursts, flaring and fading like distant fireworks. The bus moved through this underwater world with the grace of a whale. Arthur anticipated every stop. He saw the red light at the intersection of 5th and Main a block away. Instead of maintaining speed and braking at the end, he lifted his foot off the accelerator. The engine's growl dropped to a low, throat-clearing rumble. The bus coasted. Momentum carried them forward, stripping away speed inch by inch, smoothly, silently. By the time they reached the intersection, the bus was barely moving, and the final application of the brake was feather-light. There was no lurch, no forward jerk of the head, just a cessation of motion, soft as a sigh. In the silence of the stoplight, Arthur heard the boy take a sip of the tea. A small swallow, a deep exhale. The light turned green. Arthur applied the gas with the gentleness of a surgeon. The bus surged forward without complaint. This was the invisible act. The boy would never know the effort Arthur was putting into this ride. He would never know that Arthur was reading the texture of the road, calculating the friction of the rain, and modulating the air pressure of the brakes to ensure his comfort. The boy would only know that he was warm and that he was moving. Arthur didn't ask for directions. He knew the town. He knew where the houses were small and huddled together, and he knew where the lawns were wide and manicured. He had seen the boy's shoes canvas, worn at the heels. He had seen the jacket thin, generic. He made an educated guess and headed toward the east side, toward the dense grid of older houses near the textile mill. "Where do we get off?" son Arthur asked. He spoke not to the boy, but to the windshield, keeping his voice low, part of the ambient hum of the vehicle. He didn't want to startle the quiet. There was a pause. Then, a small, rusty voice replied from the back. Near the laundromat. On Elm Street." "You got it," Arthur nodded. He didn't turn around. He kept his eyes on the road, maintaining the illusion of the professional, the anonymous ferryman. They turned left. The bus was large for these narrower residential streets, but Arthur navigated it with practiced ease. The branches of old oak trees, heavy with rain, brushed against the roof of the bus scratch a sound like gentle fingernails on the metal skin. The rain was beginning to soften. It was no longer a deluge, but a steady, rhythmic shower. The sound on the roof changed from a roar to a patter, a lullaby drumbeat. Inside, the heater continued its work. The air was dry and toasty. The windows were beginning to fog up near the back, creating a cozy, private atmosphere. The world outside was cold and wet and blue. The world inside was warm and gold and dry. Arthur checked the mirror again. The boy's head was nodding. The warmth had soaked through the wet clothes, reaching the tired muscles beneath. The terror of the empty bus stop was fading, replaced by the hypnotic motion of the ride. The fear of being forgotten was being overwritten by the reality of being carried. Arthur felt a profound sense of satisfaction. It wasn't the pride of a hero. It was the quiet contentment of a craftsman. He was building a bridge of safety out of minutes and miles. He was stealing this child back from the cold. They were getting close. Arthur recognized the landmarks. The closed gas station with the flickering sign. The playground with the wet swings swaying in the wind. He slowed the bus down, well below the speed limit. He wanted to stretch this out, just a little longer. He wanted to make sure the boy was fully warm before he had to face the air again. "Almost there," Arthur murmured. The bus glided down Elm Street. The streetlights here were spaced further apart, leaving pools of shadow between them. The houses were dark, their windows black squares of sleep. Arthur scanned the curb. He saw the laundromat ahead, dark and silent. He looked for a dry spot. He didn't want the boy to step into a puddle. He saw a patch of concrete near the entrance, sheltered slightly by the overhang of the building's awning. He guided the bus toward it. He aligned the door perfectly with the dry patch. The tires kissed the curb. A gentle bump, barely felt. He put the transmission in neutral. He pulled the parking brake. Psh! The bus settled. The engine idled. The journey was over, but the spell was not yet broken. They sat for a moment in the stillness, the rain tapping gently on the roof, the heater humming its final note. Arthur kept his hands on the wheel, waiting, giving the boy a moment to wake up, to return from the trance of the ride to the reality of the night. Arthur did not turn on the bright interior lights. He left them dim. He did not turn around to demand a fare. He simply sat, a silent guardian in the front seat, waiting for the passenger to move when he was ready. The bus sat idling against the curb on Elm Street, a solitary island of light in the oceanic darkness of the neighborhood. The engine's rhythm was a low, patient thrum, a heartbeat that seemed to originate from the center of the earth. Inside, the spell of motion was broken, replaced by the heavy, sweet gravity of arrival. The The silence that filled the cabin was different now. It was no longer the hollow silence of the beginning, nor the anxious silence of the storm. It was a dense, consecrated silence, the kind that exists in a church after the bell has stopped ringing, where the air still hummed with the memory of the sound. Behind Arthur, there was a shifting of weight, the rustle of fabric, the soft suction of sneakers peeling away from the rubber floor mat. Arthur did not turn around. He kept his hands resting lightly on the bottom arc of the steering wheel, his gaze fixed on the rain-slicked pavement ahead. He gave the boy the dignity of composing himself without an audience. He listened to the small sounds of reassembly. The zip of the backpack, the folding of the towel, the click of the thermos cup being set down on a seat. Then, footsteps, slow, hesitant footsteps, moving up the aisle. The boy appeared in Arthur's peripheral vision. He stood at the top of the stairwell, hovering on the precipice between the sanctuary and the world. He looked different than he had 20 minutes ago. The blue tint had faded from his lips. His posture, previously collapsed inward in a shape of defeat, was now upright. He was still small, still wet, but he was no longer broken. He had been thawed. The boy reached out. In his hand was the plastic cup. It was empty. Arthur turned his head slowly. He took the cup. The plastic was still warm from the tea, holding the ghost of the heat that had just saved the boy. Their fingers brushed for a fraction of a second rough, calloused skin against smooth, young skin. In that touch, there was a transfer of something heavier than plastic. It was an acknowledgement. "Thank you," the boy whispered. The voice was barely audible, a scratch of sound that barely rose above the hum of the heater. But in the quiet cabin, it was loud enough. It was not a polite, rehearsed thank you. It was raw. It carried the weight of, "I was cold, and now I am not." Arthur looked at the boy. He didn't smile in a big, performative way. He simply softened the corners of his eyes. He nodded, a slow, single dip of his chin. "You keep that towel," Arthur said, his voice a low rumble, "for the run to the door." The boy looked down at the white and blue striped towel he was clutching. He hesitated, then nodded. He pulled it tighter around his shoulders, a makeshift cape against the coming night. Arthur turned to the door controls. He didn't want to open them. He wanted to keep the boy in the bubble for another hour, another day, until the sun came out. But that was not the job. The job was to deliver. He pulled the lever. Hiss, clack. The bifold doors swung open. The sound of the outside world rushed in. The wind, the dripping eaves, the distant bark of a dog. The temperature in the entryway dropped instantly. The cool, wet air swirling around the boy's ankles. The boy stepped down. 1 step, 2 steps. He hit the sidewalk. Arthur watched him through the open door. The boy didn't run immediately. He stood on the concrete for a heartbeat, adjusting to the change in atmosphere. He looked small again, against the backdrop of the dark houses and the looming trees. But he had the towel. He had the warmth in his belly. The boy turned toward a house 3 doors down. It was a modest structure with a peeling white fence and a dark front porch. He began to walk, clutching the towel with one hand and his backpack with the other. Arthur did not close the door. He did not release the brake. He sat there, a sentinel, his eyes tracking the small figure moving through the shadows. This was the most important part of the invisible act, the witnessing. To leave now would be to abandon the boy to the darkness. To stay was to say, "I am still here. You are not alone until you are safe." The boy reached the gate. He unlatched it clink and walked up the path. He climbed the wooden steps of the porch. Arthur held his breath. He waited for the fumble of keys. He waited to see if the door was locked, if there was light inside. The boy reached the door. He didn't use a key. He knocked. A second passed. 2, 3. Arthur's fingers tightened on the wheel. Then, a rectangle of yellow light spilled out onto the porch as the front door opened. A silhouette appeared in the doorway. A woman, hair messy, wearing a bathrobe. Arthur couldn't hear the words, but he saw the body language. The woman dropped to her knees. She pulled the boy into an embrace that was fierce and desperate. She buried her face in the boy's wet neck. The boy melted into her. The circuit was closed. He was home. Arthur exhaled. The tension he hadn't realized he was holding in his shoulders finally released. The air in his lungs felt lighter. The woman stood up, pulling the boy inside, but just before the door closed, just before the rectangle of light was extinguished, the boy turned back. He looked toward the street, toward the bus. Arthur was far away, hidden behind the glare of the windshield and the reflection of the rain. The boy couldn't possibly see him clearly. He could only see the bus a large, glowing beast idling in the mist. But the boy raised a hand. A small, shy wave. Arthur raised his own hand. A reflexive gesture, open palm against the glass. The door of the house closed. Click. The porch light flickered off. The street was dark again. The boy was gone. Arthur sat alone in the bus, but the aloneness was different now. It wasn't the emptiness of Act 1. The cabin felt full. It felt vibrant. The empty seat behind him still held the depression of the boy's weight. The air still smelled faintly of the tea. Arthur pressed the lever. Clack hisses. The doors folded shut, sealing him back inside his sanctuary. The noise of the world was cut off once more. He sat there for a long moment, not moving to put the bus in gear. He felt a strange warmth spreading through his chest. A physical sensation that had nothing to do with the heater. It was a glowing ember in the center of his ribcage. He looked at the empty cup in his hand. He screwed the lid back onto the thermos. Scritch scratch. He thought about the nature of the night, how it was vast and indifferent, how the rain fell on the just and the unjust alike. But he also thought about how small the bus was, and how, for 20 minutes, he had made it a universe of safety. He realized that the peace he had given the boy was now reflecting back at him. It was a ripple effect. By calming the boy's fear, he had quieted his own loneliness. By providing warmth, he had kindled a fire in his own cold routine. The grey, heavy curtain of the Kansas rain didn't seem so oppressive anymore. It was just rain. It was just water. It washed things clean. Arthur checked the mirrors. The street was empty. The house was dark and safe. He released the parking brake. He shifted into drive. The transmission engaged with a confident jolt. He didn't look back at the house as he pulled away. He didn't need to. He carried the image of the open door and the embracing mother in his mind. It was a picture he would look at later, when he was home in his own silent house. It was a memory that would help him sleep. The bus moved forward, the tyres singing on the wet road. Arthur steered it back toward the depot, the great machine gliding through the night, lighter than it had been all day. The journey back to the depot was a glide through a watery dreamscape. The town of Kansas had turned off its lights, block by block, leaving only the amber blink of traffic signals to watch over the empty intersections. Arthur drove the number 42 with a loose, easy grip, the great machine feeling lighter now, as if unburdened by the weight of the storm. He turned into the depot yard. The chain-link fence slid past, a blur of silver diamonds in the headlights. The lot was a vast, paved ocean, glistening black under the floodlights. Rows of other buses sat parked in diagonal precision, sleeping giants with their eyes dark and their engines cold. They looked like a herd of resting bison, huddled together against the night. Arthur pulled into his assigned slot. He aligned the nose of the bus with the painted yellow line, a movement he could execute with his eyes closed. He eased the vehicle to a final, permanent stop. Psh! The parking brake engaged for the last time. Now, the shutdown ritual. It was a symphony of deactivation. Arthur reached for the panel. He turned off the heater fans. The hum that had filled the cabin for hours died away, leaving a sudden, ringing silence. He turned off the interior lights. The golden warmth vanished, replaced by the cool, blue shadows of the depot yard. He turned the key. The engine shuddered, once a final, settling shake, and then ceased. The vibration that had lived in the floorboards, in the seat, in Arthur's very bones, evaporated. The bus was dead. It was just metal and glass now. Arthur sat for a moment in the dark cabin. He listened to the rain drumming on the roof. It sounded louder now without the engine, a steady, rhythmic tap-an, tap-an, tap-an. He unbuckled his seatbelt click, and the strap retracted slowly across his chest. He stood up. His knees popped softly. He gathered his things, the empty thermos, the canvas bag. He walked down the aisle, checking the seats one last time out of habit. The seat where the boy had sat was empty, but the fabric was still smooth. The nap of the velvet brushed flat. He stepped out. The air in the yard was crisp, smelling of wet concrete and diesel. He locked the bus doors. Clack. He patted the metal flank of the vehicle. A silent goodnight to the ship that had carried them through the storm. The drive to his own house was short, a 5-minute blur in his small, quiet sedan. When he pulled into his driveway, the house stood waiting for him, a familiar shape against the sky. It was dark, save for the single, low-wattage bulb he always left burning on the porch. A beacon for himself. He unlocked the front door. The key turned with a smooth, heavy tumble. He stepped inside and closed the door against the rain. The silence of the house was different from the silence of the bus. It was stationary. It was deep. It smelled of old paper, cedarwood, and the faint, lingering scent of lavender from the potpourri Martha used to make. It was a silence that wrapped around him like a heavy quilt. Arthur did not turn on the bright overhead lights. He navigated by the dim glow of the porch light, filtering through the curtains. He moved through the hallway, his boots making heavy, dull thuds on the runner rug. In the kitchen, he set down his bag. He placed the thermos in the sink. He would wash it tomorrow. Tonight was for unburdening. He sat on the wooden stool to remove his boots. He untied the laces, his fingers moving slowly, untangling the knots of the day. He pulled the boots off, one by one, setting them neatly by the door. His feet, finally free, expanded against the cool linoleum floor. A sigh escaped him, a long, ragged exhalation that emptied the last of the work tension from his lungs. He poured a glass of water from the tap. The water was cold, clear. He drank it standing up, feeling the cool liquid track down his throat, hydrating the dry spaces inside him. He looked out the kitchen window into the backyard. He couldn't see anything but blackness and the streaks of rain, but he knew the oak tree was there. He knew the fence was there. Everything was in its place. Everything held its ground. He moved to the bedroom. The room was cool. He preferred it that way. He stripped off his uniform, the blue shirt, the dark trousers, and folded them over the back of the chair. With every layer he removed, he felt lighter, softer. He put on his flannel pajamas, the fabric worn thin and impossibly soft, a second skin that promised nothing but rest. Arthur turned down the bed. The sheets were crisp, white cotton, cool to the touch. He climbed in. The mattress accepted his weight, sinking just enough to cradle his hips and shoulders. He pulled the heavy duvet up. It settled over him with a reassuring weight, pressing him down into the mattress, anchoring him to the earth. He arranged the pillows, punching them into the perfect shape to support his neck. He reached out and clicked off the bedside lamp. Darkness. Absolute and total. Now, there was only the sound. The rain on the roof. It was a steady, multi-layered percussion. Hush, hush, hush. It was the sound of the world being washed. It was the sound of a barrier between him and the chaos. Arthur closed his eyes. His body began to dissolve. The sensation started in his toes, a tingling warmth that turned to numbness. It travelled up his legs, heavy and sweet. His hands, resting on his chest, felt like they belonged to someone else. The steering wheel was gone. The levers were gone. There was nothing left to control. His breathing slowed. Inhale. Hold. Exhale. The thoughts came, but they were not sharp. They were soft, drifting images. He saw the windshield wipers. Swish. Thump. He saw the amber lights of the city blurring past. He saw the steam rising from the thermos cup. And then, the final image. The boy. He saw the boy entering the warm rectangle of light. He saw the door closing. Arthur didn't worry about him. He knew the boy was warm. He imagined the boy in his own bed, perhaps listening to the same rain. Wrapped in a blanket, safe. The knowledge of that safety was the final key. It unlocked the gate to sleep. Arthur felt a deep, resonating peace in the centre of his chest. He had done his part. The circle was closed. The bus was parked. The boy was home. The darkness behind his eyelids grew deeper, richer. It wasn't black anymore. It was a velvety indigo. The sound of the rain began to recede, moving further and further away, until it was just a rhythm, indistinguishable from the beating of his own heart, drifting, sinking, safe. The world slowed down to a stop. There was no more motion. There was no more cold. Only the deep, silent, heavy comfort of the long night. Arthur let go. And then there was only sleep.